Thanks. Chris Nelson of the Nelson Report. Thank you so much for a very personal, very moving testimony. I can't help but note that every one of you basically makes an extremely strong case for cutting off food aid as a weapon against Kim Jong-il. Every one of you says it's a mistake to negotiate with him. And yet, at the end, you also feel that you have to say, however, we need to keep the food aid coming. And yet you also say none of the food, this is what you're saying, none of the food gets to the people. There's obviously a tremendous set of contradictions here that really we're not resolving and we really should discuss.
Chris, could we let the translator give
Sorry,
I apologize.
세 분 증언하신 게 감동적이고 정말 훌륭했는데 그 식량 중단을 하라고 그러고 식량 원조로 하면 안 된다고 그러고 협상도 하지 말라고 그러는데 또 한편으로는 굶어줄 죽으니까 식량은 보내야 된다고 그래서 저 상실되는 점이 있다고 그래서 그거를 갖다가 더 토론을 해봐야 되겠다는 말씀입니다.
Thanks. And, obviously there are some potential solutions to this, such as real monitoring, but even if you're really monitoring it and it's not getting to the people. So I'm assuming that an answer is that if you cut off the food aid, then the elites have to steal more food from the system that's there, and that makes it even worse for the people. But is that, in fact, a logical presumption, or should we be seriously debating a food cutoff, which is the case that you're making this morning? Thank you.
그래서 그 배급되는 걸 갖다가 이제 확인을 하면은 여러분들 말씀대로는 식량이 하나도 주민들한테 가지 않고 엘리트나 군대들한테 간다. 그걸 갖다가 확인을 하면은 그러면은 그 다음에는 아주 완전히 식량 중단을 해버리고 얘기도 하지 말고 그게 방법이냐? 그런데 이제 그걸 물어보면서 토론을 하자는 거예요.
Since Chris directed that at the whole panel, I'm going to let Mark Noland respond first.
North Korea presents a lot of ethical conundrums, and so let me and it is clear that one wants to try to provide aid in a way that will maximize its humanitarian impact and minimize the effect of simply reinforcing the regime and its institutions, as the Koreans have noted. There are ways that you can do that other than by trying to negotiate improved monitoring, although that's obviously something one wants to do. If one, for example, expects that the aid is being diverted away from its intended recipients and into the market, one of the things you can do is essentially inject the aid into the worst parts of the country, which is to say the Northeast right now, and provide it in forms that elites don't want to consume. So provide barley, provide millet, don't provide rice. And I think that one of the things the Bush administration has done well in this policy has been its insistence that a substantial share of U.S. donations through the WFP had to go into ports up in the Northeast. So even if the stuff was being stolen straight off the ship, it was going to pool in that catchment area and presumably get to hungry people. We have been less successful on the commodity composition of aid. And in particular in South Korea, where one of the constituencies to support aid are the farmers themselves who grow rice, there has been a tendency to provide it in the form of rice, which is precisely the product that the elite wants to consume. So I would say, yeah, we understand that there is this ethical conundrum, but there are things that one can do to try to increase the effectiveness of the aid program and try to decrease this unfortunate political externality that it may have.
저희들도 사실 그 딜레마죠. 식량을 주지 말면 북한 주민들 굶겨 죽이라는 거냐. 그런데 그 식량이 결과적으로 북한 김정일 독재 정권의 연장에 기여한다는 면에서 저희는 반대하는 겁니다.
It's a dilemma for all of us defectors. We say don't send any food aid to North Korea, do we mean we want all North Korean people to die? But no. But we send the outside the world send in. Kim Jong-il continues on.
북한에서 외부에서 지어가는 모든 쌀은 들어가는 쌀과 지원은 북한 주민들을 향해서는 김정일 장군님이 위대해서 장군님이 두려워서 얼브라이트가 찾아오고 그 김대중이가 찾아오고 노무현이가 조공을 가지고 온다고 합니다. 그럼 북한 주민들은 김정일한테 더 복종할 수밖에 없고 구태선 길어지죠. 그 체계는.
Yeah, all this aid from outside the world, Kim Jong-il claims it's because he's strong. The outside world offer this aid to keep the peace. So he uses this food aid as a means of propaganda, PR to the people. I'm strong. I'm the great leader.
저는 국제사회가 주대 이제는 정말 당당하게 검증 받아야 너희들을 가져간다라는 원칙과 도덕을 북한에다가 김정일 정권에 대고 확실하게 내밀 때가 됐다고 생각하고요. 동시에 제가 라디오를 해서가 아니라 동시에 북한 주민들을 그 아까운 쌀을 그냥 퍼주는 것보다 북한 주민들을 계몽하고 그 사람들이 의식을 변해서 스스로 북한 정권이 잘못됐다. 김정일로 물러나라. 이런 자체 운동이 일어나도록 국제사회가 종신적, 정서적, 민주적 교육도 동시에 줘야 된다고 생각합니다.
Yeah, Kim believes send it in, but verify where it gets distributed. That's the condition with the aid, and stand firm with the condition. And at the same time, we have to educate the North Korean people. It's not Kim Jong-il who's giving this aid to you. There is an outside world who care about you.
제가 조금 더 보충해서 얘기했는지 모르겠습니다. 제가 역사를 좀 좋아해가지고요. 그 어떤 과거 어떤 독재 국가들이라든가 그런 국가에서 어떤 혁명이 어떤 시기에 일어나냐 그런 이렇게 분석을 했던 사람들도 있더라고요 예전에.
I studied the history, and in the past, he studied how a revolution came about under dictatorship.
그 굉장히 위축된 상황에서는 혁명이 잘 안 일어나요. 사람들이 진짜 당장 먹고 살 게 없어가지고 안 일어나는데 그 상황에서 조금 풀어졌을 때 이 사회 변화를 요구하는 사람들이 많이 있더라고요.
Completely controlled and suppressed population cannot make a revolution. But when things open a little, then a revolution can happen.
북한의 90년대 중반이 완전 최악의 상황이라면 지금 북한에 굉장히 많이, 그러니까 저희 수준에서는, 제 탈북자들이 보는 관점에서는 정말 많은 변화가, 북한 사람들이 어떤 그 마인드가 변화가 있었다고 봅니다.
Mid 1990s was the worst time in North Korea, but the defectors know things have changed now in North Korea.
얼마 전에 신문 기사를 봤는데 북한이 지금 남한하고 어떤 트러블이 생기니까 지금 중국한테 한 찰떡처럼 붙어버린 거예요. 지금 식량을 어떻게 구해보려고 북한의 뭐 간부들, 중국에 파견된 간부들이 모두 시키가지고 식량을 다 물어오라고 이렇게 지시했다고 합니다.
So North Korea being cut off from foreign aid recently, they are looking at China. So all the North Korean officials or the North Korean party officials who go to China, they are begging for more food aid and these things to China.
김정일이도 남한이나 국제사회가 아예 김정일의 어떤 그 어떤 전략이라든가 무시해버리면 본인이 더 두려워서 막 요구하고 나올 거예요. 어떤 변화를 자기가 이끌어낸다고 저는 그렇게 봅니다.
If South Korean government, if South Korea ignores Kim Jong-il completely, what he says, what he does, then Kim Jong-il will approach to South Korea.
왜냐하면 김정일이가 북한 문제에 대해서 잘 알아요. 주민들이 어떻게 변화하고 있다는 걸 다 알아요. 알고 있기 때문에 굉장히 두려움을 떨고 있습니다. 저는.
Kim Jong-il knows what's happening among the population. There is change going on. So Kim Jong-il is very scared of what's going on.
그게 가장 큰
We seem
증거가
to be getting far away from the issue that was the question asked. Is there another question in the audience? Yes.
질문에 대한 것만 답을.
Greg Scarlatti, International Science and Technology Institute. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists and ask them a question. The survey indicates that up to about 70% of the refugees in China might have families back home in North Korea. Also, we know that North Korean workers have been dispatched to factories and construction sites in the Czech Republic and the Middle East and in Dandong in China. What do we know about the role of remittances in the North Korean economy? And what do we know about the methods of transfer, formal or informal?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You want to answer?
Yeah, there's actually a paper in your packet called North Korea's External Economic Relations, and it has a section that discusses remittances from these various sources and provides some quantitative estimates as to their magnitude. The remittances, the biggest source of remittances is probably Russia. One of the issues is that in the case of the Middle East, and to a certain extent the case of Russia, China, and elsewhere, these workers are organized by the North Korean state. So the payments actually come to the North Korean state. How much is then privately remitted in addition is less clear. In the case of Russia, there is also workers who are there essentially in a private capacity, and one can construct estimates of perhaps how much they are remitting. And as I said, the paper contains some discussion of this and some quantitative estimates.
Robert, and then this gentleman.
Rob Warren, I want to say that how emotional impact this has made, your comments. Would you care, the three spokespeople, to describe, have you heard of any dissension, any unrest in North Korea? You have pointed out a great negative attitude towards the regime. Are there any rumors, any anecdotes, any information that you've experienced of growing unrest towards the regime? Thank you.
세 분한테 묻는 건데 질문이 뭐냐면은 불만이 지금 쌓이고 있는데 어떤 그게 그 체제 반대로 일어나는 움직임도 있느냐 그런 얘기예요.
우리 그 이영일 대표가 이야기했지만 북한 사람들이 그 지난 10년 동안 너무 많이 변했죠.
As Mr. Kim Seung-il said, there has been tremendous change with these past 10 years inside North Korea.
2007년 12월 달에 함흥시 송천구역에서 비디오를 보다가 남한 비디오를 보다가 걸린 사람들을 공개 재판하고 2명을 공개 청사를 했는데 그때 몰래 카메라를 들고 그 장면을 찍겠다고 했던 전혀 다른 3명의 사람이 있었고 다 잡혔습니다.
2007년 12월.
12월. 예.
December 2007, there were people who were watching the South Korean video secretly, and I'm sorry. 그러니까 비디오 보다가 잡혔지.
잡힌 사람들을 공개 청사를 하는데
And those were publicly executed there, and 3 people tried to video film the public executions. 그렇게 해서 비밀 공개 처형하는 걸 갖다가 했는데 그 필름한 것도 잡혔지 또.
예, 그걸 몰래 찍다가.
And those who were filming the public executions were also arrested.
물론 돈도 생각을 하고 그거 찍어서 외부에 내보내면 돈을 받으니까 돈도 생각했지만 10년 전, 15년 전 북한 상황으로서는 이거 간첩입니다. 간첩 짓입니다.
Of course, the motivation to film public execution, maybe they thought about selling the film, make money. But 10 years ago, nobody could ever think about filming public executions in North Korea.
그리고 아직 저희들 눈에 보이는 건 없지만 다 굶어 죽게 된 북한 군인들도 정말 총뿌리를 김정일이 돌릴 날이 난 저는 그렇게 멀다고 생각하지는 않습니다.
Yeah, I don't have proof, but I don't think it is far away. Even the soldiers, North Korean soldiers, would turn the rifle back at the regime and the Kim Jong-il.
네.
I'm Bernard Gordon, University of New Hampshire. My question is for Kim Seung Min. We have been getting reports that the conditions in the Army are so severe that the height requirements for new members of the Army have been sharply reduced. That implies great weaknesses in the Army. Is that a reasonable supposition?
예, 2002년부터 그전에는 나름대로 기준이 좀 있었는데요. 2002년부터 키, 몸무게에 상관없이 그냥 군대 안 나갔던 사람 다 나가라는
Since
법을
2002,
내놨습니다.
since 2002, height, weight requirements gone. Anybody who didn't serve in the army joined the army. They draft everybody now. And I'm sorry, Susan just told me we have to leave. Yeah.
Kang Su Jin, Kim Seung Min. Dr. Noland is free to remain here till noon if anyone wishes.
Dr. Noland, do you have any sort of statistics on what the average Chinese grain food aid was over the last 10 years and how much it's been restricted over the last, let's say, 6 months or a year? Thank you.
Yes, I actually have such data, but unfortunately I can't recall it off the top of my head. I think what I can say off the top of my head is that it has been assumed that China was providing North Korea a certain amount of grain on a continual basis, and honestly, I can't remember exact amount, and so I'm hesitant to specify a number. The current rumor is that after the deterioration of relations with South Korea, North Korea turned to China asking for both food and fertilizer. The rumor is that the Chinese, well, there's two versions about how, there are multiple versions as you can imagine, how much the North Koreans asked for and how much the Chinese provided. I have heard that the Chinese provided 100,000 metric tons, and I've heard the Chinese provided 50,000 metric tons in a response to a request for 100,000 metric tons. And I have not heard that the Chinese have actually agreed to provide fertilizer. And the issue with fertilizer is that we're reaching the point now, if it doesn't start coming into North Korea, there won't be enough time to actually get distributed to the cooperative farms so that it can be applied to the upcoming harvest.
Peter Beck from the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Sorry our panelists had to leave, but I do have a couple of specific questions for Mark. Referring to your price data, I was wondering if you could share with us the source that you're relying on. I'm just curious, but more importantly, looking at this sharp rise in prices over the last year or so really mirrors the global rise in rice prices and food prices. I'm wondering if you think it'll be possible to filter out the effect of domestically driven price increases versus externally driven price increases, with prices rising in China and other parts of the world, or do you think this is entirely domestically driven? And finally, doesn't this also suggest that in addition to the problem of having to deal with having cried wolf in the past, the World Food Program is now holding out its cup for the entire world, and it seems like if I'm a donor and I'm looking objectively at my priority countries for giving donations, those where I have the greatest access and transparency are going to be a much higher priority that North Korea is going to be on a long list of countries, a growing list of countries and governments seeking food, and that this could exacerbate the problem in North Korea?
Okay, let me try to answer each of your questions. Number one, the price data. The data set that we have accumulated over a period of years has something short of 4,000 observations, and it's put together from a variety of sources. Number two, trying to parse the differences between internal actions and the world price. What I can tell you is the increase in North Korean food prices exceeds the world price. So it's not simply that the markets are integrated and world prices are driving up North Korean prices. There is a specifically North Korean component to the story. Trying to parse it out would be a useful exercise. Let's see, Eric Weeks is still sitting there. Yeah, so that sort of your seventh next assignment is parsing out the difference for Peter Beck. And finally, on donor fatigue, yes, absolutely. And it's not just aid, it's commercial imports as well. North Korea has a history of basically jerking around companies like Cargill. And if you're in a very tight market, and you have a variety of customers, say the Moroccans coming to you, and they want to buy grain, and in the past they've paid on time and paid in full, are you going to sell your tight supply to a reliable customer or a customer who has played games with you in the past? So North Korea's mismanagement of these relationships extends not only to aid but the commercial sphere as well. And under these global conditions, this is going to pose a real problem. I just want to reiterate this. Even if you had a solution to the nuclear deal this afternoon, just the logistics of getting food and fertilizer into North Korea are such that we will almost certainly run into problems, even in the best case scenario.
If I can just add one point. One of the things Mark emphasized in his presentation was the direct foiling in the last couple of years by the DPRK regime of the bottom-up marketization of the economy. And to put this in a broader context, we saw much the same thing happen in Zimbabwe, where the marketization of food was destroyed by the regime as a matter of oppression. So we have to maintain this dual perspective, that there is the global food crisis, but that there remains ways that indigenous regimes can make it worse for their people. And it's clear that that is indeed happening in this case. Are there any other questions for Dr. Noland? Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Lee from South Korea. My question is directly go to Dr. Mark Noland. Could you give us more detailed numbers or quantity of you recommend your government, U.S. government, to provide North Korea in food aid? I think that Korean government is now considering that 400,000 tons food aid to North Korea, and comparing this figure, how much or how range you recommend the U.S. government can provide North Korea in short term? And the second question is, you recommend that U.S. government could give the humanitarian aid in unconditional base or conditional base? I mean, do you think that the six-party talk or nuclear issue should be linked with the humanitarian aid, or you just recommend the unconditional humanitarian aid? Thank you.
Okay, those are good questions. The rumor that is floating around Washington, there are probably at least a half dozen people, if not more, in this room who are better informed than I am on this, is that the United States government is considering, once the nuclear issue has been resolved to some degree at least, a potential donation of 500,000 metric tons. The problem is so that's the rumor that's floating around, and there are people from the State Department, who knows, there may be somebody from the State Department here now that will tell you not to believe everything you read in the Washington Post. Now, the problem is, if you look at the actual amount of money being appropriated for enhanced food assistance, given a whole global set of problems and rising prices, it's hard to see where the money is going to come from. I mean, prices are rising so fast that even if the U.S. government said today, yes, we're going to provide this amount of food to North Korea, it might actually have trouble scraping it together. Now, how much should the United States government give is obviously conditional on how much other countries give. If South Korea gives 400,000 metric tons, then presumably the amount that the United States needs to give is lower. If South Korea gives 0, the amount the United States or some other donors would need to give is higher. Now, on conditional and unconditional, I need to be very clear about this, because there are multiple levels here. On the fundamental issue of whether the United States ought to condition humanitarian aid on other political or diplomatic goals, I believe that those two things should be separated. I think that while I yield to no one in my antipathy towards the North Korean regime, I think we need to be quite clear. Cutting off aid or not providing that aid is not going to punish Kim Jong-il. It's going to punish working class families in Cheongjin and school children in Wonsan. And they are not in any way culpable for the nuclear program or the action of this regime. And I don't think they should be the ones punished for it. So I believe those two things should be separated. Once you make that decision to give aid, however, I strongly believe that one should go in with your eyes open about the implications of that aid. We had that discussion already. It is clear that simply providing aid channeled via the central government and in forms that the elite like to consume can well reinforce political control of this regime. So as I said, if you're going to give aid, you want to monitor it. You want to verify it as best you can. You want to try to send it to areas which are food deficit areas so that even if it's diverted, it will probably get to those people in some form, albeit probably a monetized form. And you want to provide it in forms, protein biscuits, barley, millet, that the army and or the elites are not going to want to consume. That's a second best solution, as economists would say, but I think that given the difficulties of our ethical choices in this matter and the realities of the sets of institutions and incentives we confront, that's probably the best we can do.
Back there, and then this gentleman in that.
No, you go ahead.
I'll ask both questions. No,
Just one brief question, Marcus. The Chinese have been in touch with the North Koreans. The Chinese have been in touch with North Koreans since about 1980. I'm sorry, what did you say?
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm Jim Lilly, independent. Marcus.
Former, for the record, since this is being recorded, former ambassador to South Korea, former ambassador to China, former assistant secretary of state?
Something like that.
Yeah. Okay. General all-around old head. Okay.
Okay. China's been at this, and North Korea's been at this since 1980. Deng Xiaoping took Kim Il-sung out to his home province of Sichuan, showed him the advanced provinces, what they did. They took Kim Jong-il to Shenzhen. They took them to Shanghai. They tried to work with them. We saw little moves on the part of the North Koreans, their joint venture law, their attempts at economic reform in 2002. But I'd like to hear what you consider the reasons that this has failed in North Korea, and is there any evidence that there are arguments in North Korea about the Chinese model, how far they should go? Because as you suggested, marketization leads to scary scenarios for Kim Jong-il. But there must be some kind of pressure there to loosen up this system, because they've tried a number of times and it's flopped. I just wondered your interpretation.
Before Mark answers, I'd like to ask the lady in back to pose her question.
I am Myung-Hwa Jang at Radio Free Asia, and I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Marcus Noland. Whenever I need expert comments, he has been very kind and generous, and he's up to date. Thank you very much. And in relation to this U.S. Resumption of food aid, I've talked to WFP officials in Pyongyang and Bangkok, and they confirmed that they are actually in discussion with U.S. government for a significant amount of food aid to North Korea. the humanitarian aid is separate from political process, such as nuclear discussion. So the amount has been, as you said, the rumor has 500,000 tons of aid. And the thorny issue in discussion is known to be the random monitoring. And do you think the random monitoring is possible? Because the WFP monitoring process is the best in existence. So I'm wondering whether it is the current mechanism process, like giving 2 weeks notice to North Korean authorities, that it will be maintained, or even if without that, the U.S. government is going to resume food aid with the current mechanism process.
Okay. Those are both very good questions. On Jim Lilly's question, first of all, North Korea is not China. If you look at the composition of output and the distribution of the labor force, China, when it began its reforms, and Vietnam, when it began its reforms, for that matter as well, had more than 70% of the labor force in the agricultural sector, as you know well, from having been there at that time. North Korea is very different. It's a much more industrialized country. It looks more like Belarus or Romania than it does China or Vietnam. Now, the reason that's important, and in the interest of time, I won't go into this in any great detail, but one can make the argument that the reform path for a country that has a large labor-intensive agricultural sector using fairly simple technologies to produce food is a much easier reform path than a more industrialized economy. In particular, it's much more likely to be what economists call Pareto improving, which is to say everybody is made better off. Those same reforms in a more industrialized economy have a higher likelihood of creating losers, and hence opposition to reforms, and hence make reforms more problematic or less politically sustainable. So I don't think that China is necessarily a good model for North Korea in that respect. Second of all, the starting points are very different. We now have a fairly large corpus of information about the relative success of economies in transitions. And what we find is a lot of this has very idiosyncratic and historically contingent effects, have very big impacts. One of the few things that is robustly correlated, other than having a large labor-intensive agricultural sector with success in the transition, is macroeconomic stability at the time reforms were initiated. China had macroeconomic stability in 1978 and 1979. North Korea does not, although it's improved somewhat in recent years. The one thing that North Korea actually looks pretty good on is the existence of a viable pre-socialist commercial legal code. And my impression is from other people, I don't have direct experience in this, is that North Korean lawyers and policymakers seem to be relatively conversant with the South Korean legal code because it comes out of the Japanese colonial system. And so that's one hope that they have something they can draw back upon to start formulating better market institutions. But the real issue and the real difference between China and North Korea is the division of the peninsula. I mean, when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he could make up slogans about black cats and white cats. I mean, yeah, Taiwan exists, but nobody really believes that Taipei poses an ideological challenge to reformers in Beijing. If you want to do reform in Pyongyang, you have a much more difficult political terrain. You are the junior partner in both size and accomplishment in a divided peninsula. And once you start going down that reform road, why be a third-rate South Korean when you can be a real South Korean? And so this is why this regime is so risk-averse about these reforms. And when times are good, their instinct is to pull back because they regard it as posing a potentially fundamental threat to domestic political control and legitimacy. On the second question, several responses. First of all, and I may not have given this to the earlier question about the magnitude of the donations, I don't see the United States, to be clear, I don't see the United States giving 500,000 metric tons of grain to North Korea unless the nuclear issue is resolved to, at least there's some kind of action on nuclear. If you don't get that as a practical matter, I don't see it going forward, regardless of my own preferences. Second issue, is it the WFP or the NGOs? Yes, the WFP is talking as much as they can to the U.S. government because they are afraid that the U.S. government is going to route its donations not through the WFP, but rather through American NGOs, which poses its own set of problems, the potential race to the bottom as different NGOs compete against each other. In other cases where that has happened, the first thing to go is the monitoring that you talk about. And I will simply end on this point. Monitoring in humanitarian programs in North Korea has been a long tug of war, where at times there has been progress and at times there has been retrenchment. Out in the lobby, I think there is a book being sold called Famine in North Korea, Markets, Aid, and Reform, that has an entire chapter devoted to exactly this topic. And I would recommend that book very, very strongly to you. Thank you very much.